Hello everyone, how y'all doing? Welcome to another PS Does Book Reviews. Today I'm going to talk about this, which isn't really a book, it's a magazine. Magazine from the 70s. This was offered to us, me and Christina, my wife, from a friend of ours from our booktube channel in Portuguese, Books and Beers, by a friend who knew that I'm very interested in science fiction stuff, and she found this on a secondhand store and just sent it to us. I have three of these. This is the Winter 1977 edition of Isaac Asimov's science fiction magazine. And it's good because Isaac Asimov is like one of the biggest names in science fiction, and he compiled with some editorial help from another guy this sort of magazine which has a lot of short stories, novelettes as they call them, and very small 1-2 pages sort of things, of all things science fiction. And more interesting than the stories themselves are getting the context of what science fiction was like in the 70s, the genre itself, because this was made before I was born. I was born in 79 and this magazine is from 77. So it's hard for me, even though I'm interested in science fiction, to really get a grasp of how the scene was evolving, changing, the focus of things, why they were focused on those kind of things, without having lived those things. So this really brings a lot of perspective and insight into the whole culture that was happening in the 70s. Isaac Asimov starts the editorial by saying that they are living in a privileged time where they have 3 Star Trek conventions a year. Let that sink in for a second. When he started going to science fiction conventions back in the 30s, there was nothing like this. So he tells the story of the first science fiction convention that he went to. He was already somewhat known as a science fiction writer, so he went as a person to be recognized, not as a purely a fan. But he tells of the whole story and how they got into a scuffle between other fans and the organizer of the convention, things like that, and got recognized by a lot of his writing peers. And this was in the 30s. And when this came out, we have Star Trek being the most famous phenomenon around dominating completely science fiction. And why did Star Trek become so famous? In the 70s, we were part of the space race thing. So after the Cold War, the United States and the USSR were racing to see who could be the first person to put a man on the moon, and also control the grid of satellites to do communications worldwide, and spying, of course, as well. So there is a lot of influences by that, and you can see a lot of literature from the 70s and 80s is very focused about going to space, the final frontier. That's what fueled Star Trek, and Star Trek became so popular. Star Trek was released in the end of the 60s. So I originally thought that Star Trek would be slightly more modern, but no, it's the 60s. Like, you barely had color television, and people were already doing these science fiction advanced things. So yeah, space is a very strong theme on a lot of these stories. Also, longevity is also very important. Living forever, time manipulation is also very important. The Groundhog Day kind of thing, of repeating the same day and slightly doing improvements, trying to break off the loop, and figuring out some things about that. A lot of talk about space colonization, of going to Mars. There is very interesting story by Asimov himself about the Black Widower Society, which apparently was a recurring story theme happening. He had this fictional club of characters that would analyze a problem in each little short story that he wrote. So in this story in particular, it was about the wife of a guest getting involved with a cult of people who truly believe they have been in Mars, even though traveling to Mars was still impossible. So they believe it so sternly that, well, it is a cult. The husband knows it's a cult, but the wife is immersed into it, and the husband is trying to find some scientific, logical explanation to explain to the wife that the leaders of the cult could never possibly have ever been in Mars, even in like the what they would claim was that they would be like mind transferred into Mars and they were really there. But that will happen like in their dreams. But they believe they were really transferred there. So it ends up going to a lot of astronomy concepts, planets being far away, what kind of planets you can see at what time, and that becomes the logical refutation for the whole thing. But it's very interesting that you like, as a writer, you're analyzing what happens in another planet and the astronomy of other planet and using that as plots for your storyline. So not just focusing on what happens on Earth, like focusing what happens somewhere there. So you need concepts of astronomy and physics to be able to pull this off. And this is what the Black Widow Society were supposed to be good at, like good scientific minds or logical minds in some shape or form. So also, a few other interesting things that this magazine has. It has some small puzzles where they have like they leave you a question, and then a few pages later they will give you the answer, and you're supposed to try and figure it out yourself. So a lot of focus on mysteries as well, because mystery was one of the genres that was as big as science fiction, but slowly getting overturned. Not as important as science fiction. Science fiction was quite booming. I guess science fiction comes in waves, same way that fantasy also comes in waves of interest from the audience. Anyways, other aspects that the magazine had, it focused about communications using HAM radio, shortwave radio, and the tricks that people did. And this was a very booming scene at the time. There were no telephones. There were landline phones, I think, at the time already, but there were like no cell phones. You couldn't use the satellites to communicate stuff. They were still building up the network of satellites for fast communication. There was no internet. There was no a way to access any information that you want within a few seconds. You had to find someone who knew that kind of information, go to a library, do research and that kind of stuff, to not just type something in Google. So it's very interesting to see them talk about the HAM radio scene, which is a scene that I always found fascinating and interesting, and different ways that you can use those kind of things. It has a lot of the lingo from HAM radio, which is what makes the story quite interesting to follow. And yeah, how it relates. And it's interesting to go back and try to understand 50 years later how much that still makes sense and how much it got completely deprecated from internet and the new technology that we have. Other interesting funny parts that this magazine had is it features an ad for cigarettes in color in the middle. The only page in color in the book, apart from the cover, is an ad for cigarettes, and this paid the magazine pretty much. This paid the magazine. There's even a letter from a reader complaining about this, and Asimov replies, "Well, this is how we make money. You'll have to live with one page of cigarettes in the middle of the magazine." They were both non-smokers, but cigarette was a big industry, still is nowadays, and they paid good money to have adverts on stuff. They also have a section for book reviews, which is really interesting. They talk about the latest releases. One of them is the recently released book about Star Wars, rewriting the movie. The movie came out, was very famous, so they thought, let's make a book about it as well. And they say here that the book sucks. Don't get the book. The movie is much better than the book. The last story that this features is an interesting take on different kind of cultures. They imagine a new world that was colonized somehow by leftovers of the human culture, and it dispersed into different regions and had their own cultural evolution. So they counterpoint different concepts of purity, promiscuity in terms of sex, not wanting to blend their genes with the rest of the gene pool. A lot of small things like that. The right to kill another one if they did anything wrong to you, where in another region that would be illegal, of course. In some parts, they mention that the child can do whatever they want, and you can't attack them in any way that is illegal. So the logic would be that the child would do all the wrong things before they come of age and not get any responsibility for that, and that would not like chain them down, and that would make them better human beings in the long run, which is bullshit in my opinion, but that is the concept that they are trying to explore there. So a lot of small things like that would make you think about the different cultures. It's also a little bit of an action feature-esque kind of thing. It features a lot of travel and moving around and action scenes and that kind of stuff. It's written by the same guy who also wrote some stuff for Conan. I had no clue Conan was like a written form publication thing. I thought it only happened in movies and comic books, but it makes sense that it was also written, so that explains things. So it has a mix of very physical and action-oriented kind of stuff with a lot of not really science fiction, but things that make you question the different cultures and think about the different cultures and how they intertwine with each other, what makes sense, what doesn't make sense, what is taken to the ridicule, and that kind of thing. The last thing that this has, which is quite interesting, apart from the letters from the authors, is a classifieds section where you can work from home to get additional income. They say here a lot, which is sort of what you can do nowadays, but with the internet. Back then, they needed someone to, receive envelopes and ship back envelopes to do it from their homes. So they had a lot of classifieds looking for people to do that. And also selling wives. Japanese girls make wonderful wives. Beautiful Mexican Oriental girls needing American boyfriends. All sorts of these kind of things, which is, interesting. College diplomas, the very best, perfect for display, fools everybody. Free revelation information, and then they give you a PO box, which you're supposed to send stuff. Adult products as well. Whole catalog of 500 items for $1 can be shipped to you. This is very interesting stuff. And the final page is if you want to subscribe to Alfred Hitchcock's magazine about some mystery stuff. So yeah, this was a fascinating read. Oh yeah, the back cover. You can get the very best reading in and out of this world for 10 cents with membership. So you can apply to this club and receive the best books that are coming out. You can get the Foundation trilogy by Isaac Asimov before the rest of the books of the Foundation were even released. And a very recent release, Children of Dune, which is the second book of the Dune series by Frank Herbert, before the whole thing became... Well, Dune was already a hit back then, so this was like the follow-up hit. The Star Wars book that I mentioned is also listed here. The Star Trek Concordance, A World Out of Time, which I have no clue what it is. Gateway, Lana of the Gathol and John Carter of Mars. The 1977 Annual World's Best Science Fiction. A Heritage of Stars. The Hugo Winners Volume 1 and 2. And Opuyuki Hotline by John Varley. No clue. Explicit scenes and language may be offensive to some. Naughty, eh? Naughty. So yeah, a lot of interesting stuff. I'm curious on some of these names if they ever became famous, because 50 years later, a lot of these things could actually be good and relevant, but just not have gotten public notoriety that makes them, transcend time. Even nowadays, works of Asimov are he's a very famous name, but you try to get some of his books online and it's hard to find certain books, certain specific books. You heard about them, but there is like no immediate publication available. You either have to find stuff on secondhand store or or wait for a republishing to happen. And same thing with Dune. I have Dune in all sorts of different kind of editions because it was really hard to find one single edition with all of the volumes that it had. So 50 years later, it feels like books sort of well, it's a market. It peaks when it's popular, and then it has a long tail. And if you only come on the long tail, it needs to have been something that peaked really high for it to still be on the top charts of everything. So you're missing out on a lot of hidden gems that were released or maybe not even properly released, and they just didn't take very well to the audience, and they might still be very interesting reads. So yeah, but you have to be selective with what you read, and that's what it is. Anyways, long video is long. Thank you guys for watching. Let me know what you think. If you had already read this or heard about this, if you find it interesting, let me know your comments below. See you next video. Bye bye everyone. Take care.